predict it will take 8 quarters before U.S. GDP surpasses its previous peak. That puts us out into 2011, mid-2011. And it will take at least 2 additional years, that's 2013, before the labor market replaces the roughly 7.5 million jobs it will lose due to the recession. Only then will the U.S. economy really be healed. Now, what about Georgia? How will Georgia fare in 2010? Our recovery will be slow and bumpy, but it will be sustained. We're forecasting state GDP to increase by just over 1.5%. Now, that growth is a lot better than the 4.2% decline we saw last year, but our overall projection for the country is much higher than for Georgia. Now, before I suggest some opportunities for you and your business in Georgia, let's consider why Georgia's economy will lag the country as a whole. Our state will continue to suffer because of its heavy exposure to real estate, and that downturn was the epicenter of this recession. Georgia's economy is geared towards new residential and non-residential development. So going into the recession, Georgia had an outsized construction industry. We had a huge supply bubble of residential and non-residential properties. And we had a swollen pipeline of properties at various stages of development. We've also got a high concentration of manufacturing industries that are closely aligned to construction. Things like lumber and wood products, building materials, floor coverings. Plus, Georgia's overdependence on development meant that the financial crisis did a lot more damage to Georgia's banks than to the nation's financial sector as a whole. Job losses in firms providing financial services were 30% deeper in Georgia than they were the country as a whole. Well, we think the period of heavy job losses is over, but we think there will be some job losses persisting into early 2010. We'll end up losing about 370,000 jobs in this recession in Georgia. And that's more than twice as many jobs as we lost in the previous recession. Now let's put this another way. At the dawn of the millennium, Georgia had 3.9 million jobs. A decade later, we have 3.8 million jobs. Georgia will lose about 9% of total employment. Dalton has already lost 16% of its jobs. In contrast, the nation will only lose about 5.5% of its jobs. Georgia lost a higher percentage of jobs for the same reason that the recovery will be slow. The state's heavy exposure to housing, commercial real estate, and those related industries. Georgia's job growth will finally turn positive this spring, but initially, job growth will be too anemic even to keep up with the pace of people entering the job market. Productivity gains and longer work weeks will allow many businesses to postpone hiring until the recovery is well underway. Georgia's unemployment rate will continue to rise. We think it will top out at about 11% somewhere in mid-year. Now, do you remember 2007? Georgia's unemployment rate was only about 4.5% then. If you need a job today, where should you look? Staffing and temp agencies, healthcare, transaction processing, and of course, defense and the federal government. Now, there'll be more job opportunities by the end of the year, and they'll range from retail to the financial sector. Job creation will begin to accelerate next year, in 2011. And that's when the construction begins to recover. That's when we stop losing jobs to state and many local government. But even then, we expect job losses will continue in manufacturing. Our prediction that Georgia will have a sustained recovery rests on a few likely developments. And at the top of the list, most essentially, credit markets continue to thaw. Also, sales of both new and existing homes increase in 2010. Business spending on equipment expands. Federal fiscal policy continues to provide a powerful economic stimulus. And net hiring resumes in the second quarter. Although there will be many forces powering GDP, there will also be three powerful headwinds. Spending on non-residential construction will decrease sharply in 2010. Spending by state and many of the local governments will continue declining. And even though credit will improve, it's not going to loosen up dramatically. Although the recovery will be sustained, you need to plan for Georgia's economy to underperform the national economy until real estate and construction stabilize sometime in 2011. So initially, opportunities to take advantage of this economic recovery may be stronger outside of Georgia than inside of Georgia. Now, what about consumers? You hear almost every day that consumer spending is weak, and you may be wondering, how can we recover without it? Well, the truth is we can't. However, we expect consumer spending will increase by about 1.5% this year. Improving consumer fundamentals will lead to increased spending in 2011 and then more in 2012. Now let's consider why we expect consumers to behave this way. As the recession deepened and job losses mounted, households had to shift their priorities from spending to savings. The savings rate has already risen from about 1% in 2008 to about 4.5%. We think it'll continue inching up through 2010. And while increased savings is a drag on the recovery, the adjustment is about 3/4 complete already. At this juncture, job creation and the income growth that accompanies it is absolutely vital to the outlook for both consumer spending and the Georgia economy. Our forecast anticipates that the job machine will shift into gear in the second quarter, and job growth will be just adequate to sustain the expansion. With the recent losses in household wealth and a greater focus on savings, increases in disposable personal income must account for virtually the entire projected rise in Georgian spending. The upturn in both the number of jobs and the number of hours worked per job are two factors that support this expected income growth. In 2010, consumers will spend more on services. Spending will also rise significantly on durables such as new cars, computers, and medical goods. Among non-durables, consumers will spend substantially more on food and prescription drugs. They'll spend a little more on alcohol, too. While consumer spending slowly rises, business spending will increase sharply, and it will be a powerful driver to Georgia's recovery. The growth in business spending for equipment and software reflects the strengthening cash flows and higher profits of our corporations. Corporate discipline with respect to capital outlays over the course of 2001 to 2009 was excellent. Credit will remain tight, but lending standards won't get any tougher, and that impact of tight credit will be less severe because many companies have adequate cash flows for their investment needs. Business spending for transportation equipment will increase the fastest, but only because it's starting from such a depressed starting point. Spending for computers, software, and communications equipment will also increase quickly.